The Biden administration came into office talking a great deal about the human rights agenda, and in fact, in the first month of the administration, promised to put human rights at the center of U.S. foreign policy. President Biden as a candidate was even more harsh in his assessment of the human rights situation, particularly in the Middle East. He had very angry words for President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt, who he called Trump's favorite dictator. He had even worse to say for Saudi Arabia and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, whom he blamed for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the US-based journalist. He said, and he threatened to make Saudi Arabia the pariah state that it is during one of the Democratic debates. The president also authorized the State Department to put some restrictions on the issuance of visas to Saudi officials, and in fact officials of any other country, who were reliably accused of harassing or harming dissidents abroad. This is now called the so-called Khashoggi ban in the State Department, the Khashoggi ban on visas to human rights abusers and foreign governments who extend their abuse to citizens living abroad. These are good steps, but in practice, President Biden has been much softer on a lot of these countries. There have been very few consequences for ongoing human rights abuses, even as regimes in the Middle East have continued to tighten their grip on politics and personalities, using anti-terrorism laws, for example, to jail journalists, bloggers, human rights activists, for example, prohibiting freedom of assembly, cracking down on freedom of speech. There have been very few consequences for this in any other elements of President Biden's policy. And of course, once the Ukraine war started and the energy crisis and energy prices began to come to the fore, and is being heavily covered in the US press, a lot of this talk about human rights and foreign policy towards the Middle East went by the wayside as it became necessary for the Biden administration to make up lost ground with Saudi Arabia and other oil producers so that the impact on the US consumer and in fact global consumers could be mitigated. And so that is why many people in the human rights community, both in the United States and overseas, felt betrayed by some of these reversals by President Biden and accused him of saying one thing on the campaign trail and doing quite another when he became president in terms of his human rights agenda. And that engendered a great deal of suspicion about the president's real intentions, which I don't think has abated to this day. In terms of the human rights and democracy agenda between Presidents Trump and Biden, the major difference is rhetorical. At this point, President Trump made no secret of his disdain for human rights as an important American interest to press in terms of his diplomacy with the Arab world or, frankly, with anywhere else. His priority was business, and he made no secret about that, especially when Congress made bipartisan moves to cut off sales of weapons to Saudi Arabia. Trump vetoed these attempts, saying, well, if we don't sell them weapons, the Russians and the Chinese are simply going to step in and do it themselves, and he wasn't willing to risk that economic fallout. He was very open about this. Now, what has disappointed a lot of people is the fact that the Biden administration, to all appearances, is saying one thing and doing another. They are saying all the right things about human rights and have said them in public. But in practice, they are continuing with massive arms sales to the Arab world, with perhaps some minor restrictions on sales of offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia due to the war in Yemen. But those sales are going on at a pretty high pace as it is. And it's very hard for them to point to specific wins on the human rights agenda. That since in the 2 years or so since they've taken office, and this is what's troubling to a lot of people, that a lot of leaders in the Arab world believe they can operate in terms of business as usual in their dealing with the United States. The Biden administration is saying what it has to say, but there are no real consequences for the kind of human rights violations that are going on. There has, in fact, been a great deal of continuity between the Middle East policies of the Trump administration and the Biden administration. The Biden administration focused on Trump's singular Middle East achievement, which was the Abraham Accords, bringing together initially the UAE and Bahrain in an agreement to recognize Israel and exchange diplomatic representatives. Since other countries were added, Morocco and Sudan, and the Biden administration hopes that other countries can be encouraged to join the Abraham Accords too. But what it has meant is kind of the administration ignoring some of the more traditional issues that it usually has in its Middle East portfolio in favor of trying to build on and expand the Abraham Accords. And the biggest gap in the U.S. administration's approach to the region, because of its focus on the Abraham Accords, has been its total lack of attention on the Arab-Israeli peace process. In fact, President Biden, when he met with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, also in July of last year, basically admitted to Abbas that he saw no room in the immediate future for restarting the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. He made a big show about how he felt the Palestinians' pain, but said nothing about how that was going to be alleviated. So this is a huge gap, and the Arab-Israeli peace issue has become a real casualty of the focus on the Abraham Accords. Another issue that hasn't gotten very much attention, which consumed both the Obama administration and, to a certain extent, the Trump administration, has been the crisis in Syria, the civil war there, which killed hundreds of thousands of people and displaced millions. The Biden administration has essentially ignored that because it doesn't fit into its focus on expanding the Abraham Accords and building ties between friendly Arab states and Israel. This is unfortunate because it ignores the suffering of millions of people, but it's even worse now because the Biden administration is doing nothing to discourage Arab normalization with Syria, which remains a rogue killer regime. If Bashar al-Assad is allowed to literally get away with murder, this does not bode well for the future of Biden's Middle East policy in any other respect. So there is a real concern about whether President Biden's policies towards the Middle East are every bit as transactional in nature as President Trump's were. You do something for me, I will do something for you. President Trump made no secret about that particular approach in his dealings with the Arab world. In fact, as a former businessman in New York City, that was very familiar and workable for him. President Biden doesn't have that kind of comfort level with very naked, raw kind of transactional politics. Nevertheless, that is what his administration's policy dealings with a lot of these countries have resulted in. Now, to give the Biden administration credit, they still do talk a good game on human rights issues, and I'm sure they will pick some selective fights in order to press this agenda. But the fact is, the administration has been forced, primarily because of the Ukraine war, but also the increasing competition of Russia and China with the United States for influence in the Gulf region and the rest of the Middle East. The administration has been forced to take a much more transactional approach in its dealing with Arab leaders. This applies to downplaying, in public at least, concerns about human rights, not talking about democracy and or political reform in the Arab region, continuing with arms sales as if there were no major concerns about how these weapons will be used and how they help to support regimes that continue to violate human rights. And of course, the oil crisis, which has resulted in significantly higher global prices for energy, is another forcing factor for the Biden administration in terms of how it deals with the countries that produce energy and export energy. And all of these factors have come together to essentially force Biden to deal with, frankly, reality, which in this case happens to be a series of policies that are fairly characterized as transactional diplomacy with the Arab world leadership. The fact that the Russians and the Chinese approach a lot of the countries in the Middle East without human rights or political preconditions does give them something of an innate advantage in their dealings with leaderships in these countries. The fact that the Chinese, for example, don't attach any human rights conditions to their arms sales, unlike the United States, gives them something of an advantage in their dealings with these countries. Same is true for the infrastructure projects. They, unlike the United States, for example, is not going to be interested in the environmental impacts or the impact on climate change, or again, bring any kind of human rights concerns to the table. So that is something of a disadvantage the United States has. But the advantage, however, it derives from all of this is the fact that United States dealings with these countries, when they do mention human rights or they do have an environmental concerns, is appealing to people in the countries beyond simply the leaderships who don't really care about these issues. But there are a lot of people, activists, people who live in these countries and are worried about the environment and so on, who do appreciate the fact that the United States does make these things a concern. So the very disadvantage that the United States faces from the fact that this is part of the U.S. agenda in its diplomatic dealings with the Middle East and North Africa can, if leveraged properly, have a fair amount of appeal politically to the broader populace of these countries.